Hello, this is Kevin again with Custom Micro, and today is part 3 of our video series covering the graphical interface of the FS S5500-48T6SP-R. Let's do it. We're going to pick up where we left off. We're going to start with the Layer 3 config. The first section under Layer 3 config is VLAN interfaces and IP addresses. This is where we can create our interface VLANs. Pretty simple and straightforward. Pre-canned out of the box, the switch has VLAN 1. The IP address set is 192.168.1.1. So to initially log into the switch, you can set your IP address on the same subnet range and be able to log into the switch on that IP. I've already created an interface VLAN 10, with an IP address set manually at 10.87.10.1. Come over here and we'll hit edit and you can see how that's set up. You set your interface name, IP address, subnet mask. You can also have a secondary and tertiary IP address on that VLAN, which is nice. We can even walk through one. Let's add one for interface VLAN 20. So VLAN interface name 20, manual config. Your other option is DHCP auto config. We'll set this to 10.87.20.1, subnet mask 255.255.254.0. Gives us a few more IP addresses on that range. You can set a secondary and tertiary IP, not necessary for this example. This will correspond with our VLAN 20 on the switch, and we'll hit apply. And there it is. Very easy and simple to do. Now let's go and look at another Layer 3 feature that will be extremely useful to you. DHCP server. I've already enabled the DHCP server on the switch. Now if we look at the DHCP address pool, I've already preemptively created one called Inside Wire. This corresponds with that initial VLAN interface 10. And you can see the IP range or IP subnet, mask, gateway, and all those things. And you can edit this DHCP pool. You can add DHCP address pool. You can add bindings to that. So let's say, for example, earlier we talked about binding IP addresses to MAC addresses. You can do that under the DHCP setup. So we can set a MAC address to our device, put an IP on there, and as soon as that device connects to the network, it will grab the IP that you set here. So that can be a very handy feature. And then in the last tab over, you'll see DHCP address bindings. And so as devices are connected to the switch dynamically, they receive an IP address dynamically through the DHCP server that's embedded. You'll be able to refresh and see a list of all the IP addresses, MAC addresses, and things of that nature. This is not a full ARP table, if you will, because static addresses are not going to be listed here. Right now, my IP address of my laptop is set statically, so it's not in the list. So let's create a new DHCP address pool to see how that works. We'll click Add. We'll give it a name. Earlier, we created a new VLAN interface, VLAN 20. This will be our corporate wireless network. So the network number will correspond with the subnet of that IP range, 10.87.20.0. The network mask, if you recall, is 255.255.254.0. That corresponds with a /23 if you change the notation. And the gateway will, of course, be 10.87.20.1. Then you can add the address range. So you say add, and we can create the range to be 10.87.20.50 all the way through 10.87.21.254. So that should give you ample IP addresses for this DHCP pool. Now we can set the DNS servers. Because this is our inside corporate wireless network, we would typically add an internal DNS server, but for this example, we'll just add Cloudflare's 1.1.1.1 and Google's 8.8.8.8. And we'll apply that. And there you go. There is our new DHCP pool. So that concludes the area of DHCP server with just a little bit of a sample of how you would set that up. So the next section is static routing. Just for an example, let's go ahead and add a static route. Let's say you have another network segment, maybe a completely different style of IP range. Let's say you have a network that's 192.168.0.0. That's your network address. So then we have our subnet mask. Let's say it's just a /24, so it's 255.255.255.0. You can set that to an interface hop, if you will, or you can just go down to the forwarding address, which will be the next hop address. And let's say in order to get to 192.168.0.0, we need to go to, let's say we have a switch that's 10.87.10.25. So that is another switch that's on the same subnet as our inside wired, and that's the next hop to get to this network. In other words, that layer 3 switch would be the source of that network. That interface VLAN would be created on that other switch. Maybe it's a core switch, maybe it's an edge switch. And in order to get to this 192.168.0 network, the next hop would be, 10.87.10.25, which is the IP of the other switch. That's how easy it is. We'll go ahead and hit apply, and there's our static route. We have OSPF routing, so if you have dynamic routing, if you have that set up on your network, you can enable that. You can add processes for that. You have your IGMP proxy. You can add to there. You have to make sure IGMP is enabled. I believe that was under the layer 2 configuration. And that rounds out the layer 3 config. Short and sweet and to the point, but it gives you the features that you expect and you need for your layer 3 configuration of this switch. Now let's move on to the next section, which is advanced config. Under advanced config, we have our quality of service config. So we can set a value on the different interfaces between 0 and 7. So if you have certain interfaces that need to have priority, maybe it's voice connections, voice over IP, maybe video, some things of that nature. You can set the proper quality of service on those, the priority. The next section is IP access list. These are your ACLs. This is the security you can set up between your different VLANs and interfaces. There's a lot of options here. We're not going to walk through all of them, but you have your IP access list config and IP access list application on these two tabs. If we were to add an ACL, we can give it a name. We can say guest network, something along those lines. You can set it as a standard or extended ACL and click apply. Once it's created, you can go over and choose edit under operate. And then you can actually add the parameters for, in this example, this extended ACL. And you see there's a whole plethora of options under here. Of course, you could always set this up through the command line, but it's nice to be able to create your ACLs right here in the graphical interface. Stay tuned, because we're going to have an upcoming video where we walk through a basic configuration of this switch through the graphical interface. Then we're going to do something pretty neat. We're going to take and export the config file, and then we're going to use that as a cheat sheet of sorts to show you how you can set up the command line interface and learn the different parameters and different settings in the command line. But for now, we'll go back from here. You also have a MAC access list, so you have ACLs you can set up based on MAC address, which is nice. You have your basic HTTPS config. This is really just for the web interface of the switch. You can import a certificate, whether it's one that you generated through Let's Encrypt or maybe one that you pay for. That'll just allow you to have HTTPS access to your switch through the web interface. And you also, if you're importing a key file, you can put in the password and all those things that you'll need to do. Then under network management, we have SNMP version 1, version 2 community strings, and you can add those and set those up. If you have a third-party monitoring tool, this will be you can set this up appropriately for your SNMP traps, etc. You have your RMON config, so if you have remote monitoring of some kind, you can set up all of your different settings here. Underneath diagnostic tools, we have one lonely tool, and that's the ping tool. I do believe that FS is dedicated to improving their software features of their network switching. So we may see something in the future, maybe a trace route option or some other things. But for now, you are able to ping things. You have your destination address, you have your source address, which can be useful, especially when you have a bunch of interface VLANs, as we have set up on this switch and are going to set up in the future for our tutorial and walkthrough. So then you can even set up the size of the packet. This can be very helpful if you're troubleshooting jumbo packets. Because if you recall, from your host computer through to your NAS or SAN or other device that you've set up jumbo frames, you have to make sure that all the devices along that chain support that same frame size, that same packet buffer size. And so make sure if you want to test that out to see if it can support jumbo frames, you can set that here. You can put in something like, for example, a 9000 and see if that MTU will work between the switch and the destination. Could be a server, could be a storage array, etc. And then finally, we have the system management section, and underneath there we have user management, where you can set up users and their access level. One thing that's very important to note, and we mentioned this in the part 1 video, that by default, the FS switch stores the password in plain text in the config file. But there's a command you can run in the command line interface that will set the password to be encrypted, to store it in an encrypted format. And so you'll want to stay tuned for our command line walkthrough where we'll show you how to do that, because that's very important that your password be encrypted in the config file. Next, we have log management. We can enable logging on the switch and the buffer size of that. And if you recall, back on the device status page, there's a log query section. So if you enable logging, then you can query and search through those logs based on day and time, etc., which can be very useful. But make sure you enable logging first. So let's go back to the next section under System Management, which is Startup Config. You'll notice you can export the startup config. Keep in mind this is different than the running config. Make sure when you make changes to the switch, when you're done, go up and click Save All. That will take the running config and save it to the startup config. If you back up the startup config, but you've not saved all your changes, then there's a chance that your startup config could be missing some things. So it's very important. You can export that, and it will give you a nice little plain text file with all your config information. You can also import a startup config file. You just simply choose the file and you import, and notice in nice red font it tells you that reboot will be required after you import a startup config, which makes complete sense. Then we have system software. You can back up a copy of the current system software and firmware, and then you have the ability to update the system. And so when you do update the system, you can go ahead and check the box that says reboot the device automatically after the update. You point it to the new firmware file, and you just can click upgrade. There are ways to upgrade the firmware through the command line. This is a very easy way to do it in the graphical interface. And then finally, you can reboot the switch. I do like the fact they've used the normal term for rebooting a device, which is reboot, as opposed to some other network switches I've seen where they use the term reload or reset or some variation, which is very confusing, and you're not sure if you're going to wipe the entire config or reboot the device. So in this case, you can't make a mistake. It's simply reboot. That concludes part 3 of our walkthrough of the graphical interface of the FS S5500-48T6SP-R Layer 3 48-port PoE Plus network switch. You're going to want to subscribe to our channel, click the bell icon to be notified for future videos that we'll be releasing. We'll have the walkthrough of how to configure the switch for a real-world scenario through the graphical interface. We'll take that and use it as a cheat sheet to see how we could do the same configuration through the command line, plus some additional things. We're going to walk through how to stack this switch. Yes, that's right. We have 2 of these switches, so look for that video of how to stack these switches together using BVSS. Also, make sure if you've missed part 2 or part 1 of this video series, you go back and get a robust and thorough walkthrough of the different features that are available in the graphical interface of this switch. Well, that's all for now. We'll see you next time.